So,
There
who are
we
these
are.
characters, Joe?
That's five. Yeah. We started out with six, and one guy had to leave before we really got started. These are the first scientist astronauts, and we have an Air Force pilot, an engineer, a geologist, a researcher, and a physician. The other physician didn't make it all the way, and so yeah, it all. I started out as a boy and graduated from medical school at Northwestern in Chicago. Took my internship in the DC General Hospital, a big charity hospital in Washington, DC. And uh, I had signed up for a residency in pediatrics, but as my experience went on in DC, I decided that pediatrics was probably not the direction I wanted to go. So I called up and canceled that residency application. And about 2 weeks later, got a letter from the Navy saying, "Hello there. You've been drafted in the doctor's draft, and you can call such and such a number to get your assignment." I was in Washington, so I didn't call. I hustled over to the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery and found the right desk and said, "What have you got?" And he said, "Well, there's a clinic up in New England somewhere. There's a destroyer squadron. Keep talking." He said, "There's one seat left in the flight surgeon training course down at Pensacola, but you have to sign up for 6 months extra." And I said, "Sold, I'll take it." Uh, and so I did that. I spent my 6 months at Pensacola. My little brother was down there doing flight training as a young Marine. And and at the end of that 6 months, they give you about 25 hours of actual flight training. They put you through the primary course. And if you pass the A-12 check and the physical, you get the solo. And I got the solo. So I went back to my Marine squadron, just all dizzy with the excitement of maybe being a naval aviator one of these days. Meanwhile, I did get assigned to the Marines in Cherry Point, North Carolina. There were two new flight surgeons. The other guy was married and I was single. So when one of the squadrons had to go aboard the USS Essex for a 7-month cruise, I was the lucky guy that got to go. The senior medical officer called me in and he asked if that was okay. And I said, sure. And he said, "I'm going to give you a case of those little 2-ounce bottles of brandy that we use for special circumstances when a guy's had an accident or a frightening situation or something like that." And he said, "I don't want any of them back." So, okay, off I went with my Marines, and we had a wonderful cruise. They let me start and taxi the airplane before we got on board the ship. And, I took care of them and they took care of me. They had a plan for all 18 of the pilots in the squadron getting their 100th carrier landing of the cruise on the same day. And they were carefully working the schedule toward us. And the executive officer came in for his annual physical and he had a hernia. It wasn't a big hernia, but it was there. And I said, "That's disqualifying, And he told me the story. And I said, "Well, how soon is the big day?" And he was about a couple of weeks away. I said, "No problem. I will write a snail mail letter back to the Bureau recommending your disqualification pending surgery. And by the time they get the letter and respond, you will have made your 100th period landing." So everybody was happy and came home. And I, after a couple of tries again with the bureaucracy, got assigned to flight training, back to Pensacola for basic, out to Corpus Christi, Beeville, Texas, actually, for advanced training, carrier qualification in the training aircraft. Got my wings in 1962. And now I was assigned to a Navy squadron back on the East Coast. Got some good flight time there. And we were sitting around watching the news in 1964, we being my wife Lee and I. And it was the Huntley Brinkley news show. And at the very end of it, Mr. Brinkley said, "And NASA has announced that they will hire scientist astronauts to go to the moon. And she looked at me and said, "You probably want to do that." I, yes, I would. And I got busy and applied through the Navy. And meanwhile, the Navy and the National Academy of Sciences were deciding how to get the group ready for the physicals and the interviews. And there was a misunderstanding. Then NASA told the Academy they were going to hire 15 people. The Academy thought they wanted 15 candidates. They only sent 16 people. So there we were. And if we could pass the physical, I had inadvertently memorized the 2020 line on the I-code. I did so many of them. I still remember it. DEFPOTEC. Check it out. And so got through the physical just fine. Waited about 3 months for them to announce who was in. And then in the spring of 1965, I got that phone call and made it into the astronaut program.
That's fantastic. That is fantastic.
It's good luck. It's just a series of things that happened that made a pretty ordinary guy. And I never was really a scientist. I was a physician. And if you had an MD, they thought you were a scientist. But not all MDs are scientists or guys who conduct experiments. A lot of good medical experiments get conducted. MDs are physicians who treat people and learn how to treat them better. And that's what I was good at.
Not many MDs know how to land an aircraft on a carrier ship, though.
Well, this is true. That couple thousand hours of flight time plus the degree is what got me in. Absolutely.
Just one last part on this section. What sort of aircraft were you flying there, Joe?
Excuse me?
What sort of aircraft were you flying?
Oh, well, I flew the training aircraft. The advanced training aircraft were the F-9F Cougar and the F-11F Tiger. The F-11F was a pretty exciting airplane. It was a supersonic airplane, but it only had about 45 minutes worth of fuel if you were using afterburner. And that's why it never made a splash in the fleet. But we used it to qualify, and then we carrier qualified in the Cougar. I went to NASA, and they flew T-33s, which was an old straight wing trainer, and T-38s, which was a supersonic Air Force trainer. We flew T-38s for that time. So when you're a young astronaut and they're just swinging into the Gemini program to the moon was already the goal. The Gemini program was to find out how to rendezvous, find out how to do spacewalks, and a couple things like that to get ready for Apollo. And they just put me to work, going to meetings, testing stuff, little stuff at first. And I was lucky enough to get the suit testing job with the astronaut office.
Actually, I think I've got a picture of that in the next slide.
Probably do, yeah. I got to, get tried on and fitted for about 3 different Apollo suits. Yeah, there we are. And that was a great achievement for me because it came in real handy when Skylab got started. And then after a while, I got to be on the crew of the space chamber tests, the altitude chamber tests of the command modules.
Well, we'll get to that shortly, Joe. I've got a few pictures of that for you. So let's keep going here on the slide deck, if you don't mind. And that'll give...
back to this group.
There we go. So here's you in what looks like a lunar module training.
Actually, those were early versions of the Apollo suit. You can tell because they have the bubble helmet instead of the fit-on one. And we're in the lunar module in 1G, just checking out, is it big enough? Can we get through the hatches? What about sleeping overnight in that thing? And donning and doffing suits and stuff like that. That's Rusty Schweikert on the right, who was a pilot in the group ahead of us.
And who's that down the bottom?
That's a moon alien,
I reckon. Yeah, don't recognize the face. So we kept on training, finally, I was assigned as a capsule communicator. Oh, lunar boots. There's another one with
There
me.
you go, you and Rusty.
Yep. And so I was assigned Capcom, one of 3 Capcoms on Apollo 13. Oh, you're getting ahead of me again. This is the.
Oh, actually, this is going backwards slightly, Joe. I think this is before
pretty
you.
good because I can get into more detail on this training. That is a spacecraft, and I can't tell from the visual whether it's the spacecraft 008, which was our Block 1 test vehicle, which we tested in that chamber in 100% oxygen before the Apollo 1 crew started their final training. And that was a lousy spacecraft. The one they were training on and the one we were training on, it gave me the chills afterward to realize that we did the same procedures that they did. And fortunately, we did not get a spark that ignited a fire and killed all 3 of us, which is what happened to them. So
yeah, I think this is your TV1 mission that you spent several hours in.
The whole team, the contractor and astronauts and engineers spent the next year or so redesigning the command service module so that would never happen again. And while they were at it, they did some more things to upgrade it. One of the great things they did was to take all the wiring on the floor of the command module and encase it in a sort of a hard gel to make absolutely certain that it would not be tramped on and broken or get wet or anything like that. And that was key to our survival in Apollo 13, although we didn't know it at the time.
So were you involved in any of that design review and testing, Joe?
Yeah, I was. I looked over what they were doing in the flammability world. And then I joined a team led by Aaron Cohen, who was the first time I'd met Aaron. He eventually became the chief designer, program manager of the space shuttle orbiter. And but the task of that team was to decide what kind of atmosphere to substitute for this highly flammable 100% oxygen that we were using up to that time. And the doctors wanted 80% oxygen because it carries you through the whole thing with a sea level equivalent. The engineers wanted a 30% oxygen because it was pretty guaranteed with the materials changes that it would be totally safe from flammability. But 30% was unsatisfactory from a crew point of view because you launched with 30% oxygen at sea level. The spacecraft vented as you went up to orbit so that when you reached orbit, your total pressure had gone from 14 psi down to probably 6 and then drifted down to 5. At 5 psi, 30% oxygen, and we were going to be unconscious at best. So we collaborated and ran the numbers and decided that 60-40 was the right answer. 60% oxygen, 40% nitrogen, together with a whole lot of materials changes. And then 2TV1 was the first spacecraft to test that configuration. Having helped to decide on it, I got to test it. And so we made quite a big deal out of 2TV1 that we got a crew patch and spiced it up a little bit by doing it in Latin. It's the Latin for the proud bird with the heavy tail. It's a takeoff on the Continental Airlines proud bird with a golden tail. And I wrote a note to the chairman of Continental Airlines to ask if that was okay. And he said, hell yes, and if you want some stewardesses, just call.
So just with that oxygen, that atmosphere on the Block 2 command module, it was the percentage you gave before was, did that vent and change once you got into space? Did it then go to a pure oxygen environment?
Here's what happened. We didn't change the system to be a 2-gas system. It was still a 100% oxygen system. But on the pad, as soon as the crew closed the hatch, and the hatch was changed from an unopenable inside to an outside opening hatch, which was great. Or the other way around, it was a hatch that opened out outside and could be opened by the crew. But as soon as that was closed, the command module was purged with a mixture of 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen. So you launched with that. At 6 psi or so, you were in orbit and the valves closed. And from that point on, and you were at an equivalent altitude of about 8,000 feet. No sweat for a pilot. And then the makeup of leakage and crew use gradually brought it throughout the mission up to pretty near 100% oxygen again. But it was at 5 psi, so it was safe.
So I think I read you spent 177 hours in there doing all of the tests and procedures, and
Right.
then this is a picture of you guys inside, looking pretty.
That's it. That's
bored.
it. Yeah. It was a good crew. It was me and Vance Brand and Joe Engel. Joe was already an astronaut, although he hadn't flown in space. He had gone up over 50 miles in one of the Air Force test vehicles, and so he had his astronaut pin already. And we had a good spacecraft. It was like night and day from spacecraft 8 to TV-1, which was spacecraft 098 off the assembly line, passed in every respect. And so when we got done with our 8 days and they let us out, we decided to go home and dress up as hippies to give the report to the program manager. There we are. It's us in the elevator going out with our beards, and this is us utilizing those beards to make our report to program management.
Joe, you haven't changed at all.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, so that was 2TV1, and that led me to my next assignment. Oh, by the way, I will just mention here that that the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center was already pressing on with a plan to build Skylab. And in between these other things, a couple of us were getting to go there maybe 3 or 4 times a month to participate in the design process and to do some training. So I began to get into Skylab on a part-time basis that early, and that was priceless.
I noticed in this picture that Joe's got an IV in his arm there. Looks a bit.
That's right. That's right.
A bit brutal.
He looks spaced out, which is he's the best pilot I ever flew with. He is a great stick and throttle man, and
yeah,
nothing fancy either.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, never got to walk on the moon. He was scheduled to go on Apollo 17, but your colleague geologist Jack Schmidt got that spot.
Was that 16 or 17?
17, yeah, the last one, yeah.
The last one. Joe Engel, he took it like a man. The science community insisted that having gone through all this trouble to find a fine geologist and train him up, and Jack was a very well-trained guy who participated in the mission all the years he was there and was really ready to go. I'll go back to a remark that came out in Apollo 11 as they started looking at the moon, and the command module pilot said, "Wow, a geologist would go nuts if he saw this." And 3 days later, Jack Schmidt went nuts.
That's fantastic.
He flew on that flight and never stopped talking for 3 days, and it was all good stuff. He was an excellent scientist, astronaut.
Yes, yeah. Well, of course, the last 3 missions that were planned up to 20 were killed off, so that made the seat shuffle a bit more brutal, I suppose.
Well, the cancellation of those last 3 Apollo flights again had a excellent side effect for Skylab, because the original plan had been to launch Skylab on a Saturn I rocket, which is a 2-stage rocket. So you had to use the stage to get into orbit. Then they would empty out the liquid hydrogen, and we, the crew, would spend the entire first mission putting things in place. And where they'd come from, they hadn't even planned on that, It was a terrible system. And when we got a Saturn V, it just changed the complexion of the whole program, because we got to build it carefully, test it on the ground, and then launch it all in one piece.
So, Joe, from a personal perspective, did you get an inkling that you might get a chance to go to the moon yourself, or was that kind of a different stream?
Didn't understand the question. I'm sorry.
I'm just wondering, during your time as an astronaut, before the end of the moon landing series, did you ever get an inkling that you might yourself be able to go to the moon?
No. In fact, the very first pilots meeting after we were selected, I was sitting in the back of the room, and Al Shepard was up front going through his Monday morning stuff, and he said, "We're going to be picking up some new crews for the later Gemini missions here in the next couple of weeks. Just raise your hand if you want to go." I raised my hand. He said, "Put your hand down, Kerwin." There was never any doubt in my mind that I was not going to go to the moon, but that was okay, because the credentials I had just cried out for Skylab.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, you want to show me some more pictures that I can talk to?
Yeah, well, so you mentioned it before, so I thought I'd jump into this. So you got the assignment to be Capcom on Apollo 13. Do you want to talk about how that came about?
One of three. It was myself and Jack Lausma and Vance Brand. And, you don't know how it comes about. They just tell you. And it came at the right time, because it was not written down, but it was pretty much nailed in that if you wanted to get on a flight crew, you ought to be a Capcom first and see how you made out on that. So I was very happy to have Apollo 13 Capcom duties. And we started training with the crew and traveling with the crew, and parceling out the different phases of the mission to decide which of the three of us would do what, because you can't do it all, you can't learn it all that fast. And I was lucky enough to get the lunar surface work as well as launch and entry, and the other guys got the burns and the orbit changes and stuff like that. And we worked out a careful schedule, and about 2 weeks before launch, I was called into a meeting at Chris Kraft's office. He was the center director by that time, and along with the prime crew. And he said, you probably have heard this already. I hadn't, but the rest of them had, that the crew was, one of the backup crew members' families came down with German measles. And so we tested everybody for German measles, and everybody tested positive, meaning they'd had it in childhood and were not at risk, except Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot. So the process is to remove Ken from the prime crew and substitute Jack Swigert. And I didn't know how much of this had already been decided, and I sort of raised my hand and said, "Gee, I'm not sure that's the best decision, Dr. Kraft, because that Dr. Berry made. I assumed he'd made it." Because it's such a mild disease in adults, and because the crew has done most of their training as a crew, and that's a priceless asset when you're up in orbit. And Kraft turned his beady blue eyes on me and said, "Dr. Berry didn't make that decision. I made that decision."
Right.
So I shrank to 6 inches high and put my damn mouth shut for the rest of the meeting. Okay. So we launched with a command module pilot who had trained as a backup, and they gave him a few quick sessions and declared him fit, and indeed he did a good job. And off we went, and things proceeded nicely until we were pretty close to the moon.
We'll get to that in a minute, Joe. I just wanted to pop this up for everyone to have a look at. This is prior to the launch, and in the Canberra Times, a newspaper article talking about a couple of dodgy-looking characters running through some mock emergency procedures, which actually came to
Mike Dinn on the left. Yeah, much
yeah,
better.
that's it.
Yeah, I'll be done.
It's actually captioned wrongly, or rather more accurately, the photo was put in the newspaper mirror image. And so I massaged this to get the photo back right, but that made the caption wrong. So apart from that, it's accurate.
Okay. Excellent.
And
Excellent.
John's got his cigarette there, which everyone seemed to have back in the 60s.
That's how we got to the moon. We all smoked.
That's right.
Smoking there'd be a panic in mission control these days if you had lit up a cigarette. I can tell you that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So everything was going along very well, and I went home after my shift.
So that's the wrong picture.
I was watching TV, but we turned it off before anything happened. And just as I was leaving, I think I heard something about problem, but I went to bed. Midnight, I got a call from Vance Brand. He said, "Joe, we've had a terrible problem with the command module. The lunar mission is off. Come on over." So I went right over like everybody else. We redid the Capcom schedule to fit what was going to happen, and just started working that problem. And in our off time, we would go to the meetings to find out what was being said and what was being done. Meanwhile, I had missed that first critical couple of hours when they were faced with data that didn't make any sense to anybody in mission control, and it took them a little while. That comes at the very end of the mission, but that's Ken Mattingly on the left. But they finally figured out that something had happened, that they were running out of oxygen in both tanks, and they had better shut the command module down right now as soon as they powered up the lunar module and got the software that said where we were in space and deliver it over to the LEM. So that was a quick 20 or 30 minute episode. And the command module, which was not supposed to ever be powered down once it left the building facility in California, was powered down completely because we had to save that battery power, which is all we'd get to get home on. It had a little less than 3 hours. Later in the mission, somebody found a sneak circuit that allowed them to charge back the 20% or so on one entry battery that had been used. So we entered with 3 hours. And Ken Mattingly, who was on the ground because of the German measles, was assigned himself, I don't know exactly, to go on over to the simulator and spend the next 3 days working on the command service module power up and entry procedure. Most important procedure he'd ever worked on. And it was lucky that we had him because he knew the spacecraft thoroughly. He's a workaholic, and he came together with the other members of the team in the simulator and got that entry plan, which brought the thing up from a dead, cold, wet, lifeless command module to a working beast up there in less than 3 hours.
Yeah, that was shown, that part of it, and it was fairly accurate in the Apollo 13 movie with Ken in the command module simulator. Yeah, so it was
right.
And here's a young man in mission control. You don't look too panicked here, Joe. So is this prior to the explosion or not?
He's just making absolutely sure what he is supposed to say before he says it. That's our basic job, is to translate what's going on into astronautese and then tell the crew, answer their questions, give them the direction that the flight crew, that the team leader wants them to have, and generally manage that communications loop. So there we are.
Joe, the temperature in the lunar module was, in the movie at least, said to be something fiendishly low. Was that true?
in the high 40s, I think it was. Yeah. And unfortunately, they didn't have any cold weather gear up there. And they decided not to stay in their spacesuits because that was very clumsy and they couldn't go to the bathroom and a bunch of things like that. So they just put on any spare underwear they had and shivered through it. And that's in part how Fred Hayes got a kidney infection that had him with a pretty high temperature and feeling terrible by the time they got down. But the team got together. They got the LEM activated. They burned the LEM to go from the current orbit they were in to a circumlunar return orbit. And then they had some hours to spend deciding how fast they had to get back in order not to run out of everything. Everything being power, number one, oxygen, number two, and some other things. And yeah, here's one of those meetings. There were other meetings in rooms back and forth, but that's a pretty good group. This is Jim McDivitt on the left, and Deke Slayton, and me, and Vance, and another one of the flight directors, a great guy, but I'm blanking on his name, and controllers, and everybody talking it over. What are we going to do next? And they had some options. They could have taken a chance and burned the service module engine, brought it back up and burned it. Fortunately, they decided that was way too risky, and the engineers at Rockwell were dead set against it. And so with the lunar module engine, they could burn all of it and get back in like 120 hours. They could burn less of it and get back in, what was it, 144 hours, about that. And they decided that they could hang in that long and not do the max burn. And so they did the paracynthian plus 2 burn to get back on that approximately 140-hour trajectory. And then they had to power down almost everything in the lunar module, including the main computer, which was never supposed to be powered down. I sat in the back of the room on that one where a couple of guys just shouted at each other, but the decision had to be made. They had to get down to 10 amps or whatever it was, and otherwise they weren't going to make it. So they shut everything off. The comm went to the low power antenna. And as a result, we Capcoms spent hours sitting at our desk, hugging the earphones to our ears to hear through the chatter and the fog, any voice coming from the spacecraft, at which point we would say, Odyssey, Houston, go to the high gain antenna and we'll talk. And we'd do that and then go back. They shut down everything they could, and that's why it got so cold. It was cold in the lunar module and cold in the command module because there just wasn't enough power warming things up, and everything got cold.
And of course, there was the carbon dioxide levels were increasing. So
I was just going to talk about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, with CO2 levels approaching 15, and if it got to 25, it would have killed them. This was no fool, and we had to do it. And we had the problem that the command module round lithium hydroxide canisters didn't fit in the lunar module rectangular container. So the crew systems guys got to work on that right away. And about halfway back, I'm sitting there at my console, and the door opens, and a bunch of engineers, some of whom I recognized, came in with a big brown box and set it down on the floor in front of me and said, okay, get down here. We're going to teach you how to do this carbon dioxide guy. And I did. And they showed me how we're going to use the checklist pages and the hose from one of the suits and all these different pieces of hardware, and get it all together into an assemblage which you could put a lunar module, a command module round thing, and then plug it in where the lunar module one usually goes. And I did that, and I did it twice, and then I called Jack Swigert, said, Jack, we're going to fix the CO2 problem. Then first I'm going to give you a list of things to get together. And I went down the list of things, and Jack said, well, okay. And it sounded as if he didn't think this was going to work at all. It worked. He put it together properly. Took an hour or so. He plugged it in, and that carbon dioxide started down within minutes. And it was back to 2 or 3 millimeters of mercury within a couple hours. So it was really great. And then they came on the next big episode that I remember was when we were getting ready to separate the command service module from the lunar module and the service module. And the first thing to do was to get rid of the service module. So they let that one go, and everybody gasped because there was a huge gash all down the side of the service module and right into the area of the service propulsion system. And everybody quietly said, man, I'm glad we didn't try to burn that guy. But that was just an astonishing moment. And then on we went. And the next big thing was for Jack Swigert to find 2 stars and align the system so that it knew to 3 dimensions where we were, and he could then go ahead and use the flight plan attitudes to get into the right attitude for reentry, and we were getting close. Obviously, we had powered up the command module by that time, and by the way, the command module powered up perfectly. There were no problems with it, and I think all that extra work that was done on it after the Apollo 1 accident had to do with that being so successful. So Jack is in there, and he still got the lunar module on. I can't remember now why, but it had to be there. And so sunlight was shining down into the telescope, and he was having a lot of trouble identifying the stars. And he would identify one star, move to another star, mark on that, and the computer measure the star angle and the difference between his calculation for those stars and what it ought to be. And he was getting big numbers. And I'm sitting there in the Capcom seat looking up at Gene Kranz, and Gene Kranz is listening intently. And I'm just silently saying, we don't have much time. We don't have much time. He looked at me and just said nothing. He just waved his hand back and forth like that, saying, let him go on. We got to do this. And wasn't a minute later that Swigert yelled out, 5 balls, meaning 0.0000. He had nailed it. And immediately, it's time to ditch the lunar module, get in the right attitude, make sure everything was set up, and then coast home. And that's when we relaxed for a minute, and Swigert said, Joe, you've got a good bedside manner.
We're going to get to that in a couple of slides, Joe, but what I thought I'd do now, as you can see, there might be a station you may be familiar with on screen. What I thought I'd do is bring in some of the other participants now and talk about what was going on. You're obviously very busy over in Houston, but there was a lot of activity going on in Australia at that time. And John, Mike, you want to talk to what was happening in Timbinbilla and the rest of Australia?
Well, my recollection was after the explosion, someone came on. We hadn't quite acquired then. It happened in Goldstone's View. We were about half an hour, I think, from acquisition. But the first thing was a call from somebody at Houston saying, hey, can we get Parks up? And I said, well, no, it's not scheduled for this mission. The moon was too far north. And they said, oh, well, Mr. Kraft will be calling your director shortly. Now, I wasn't privy to that, but I gather that Chris Kraft called Tom Reed, or Don Gray, actually, it was at that time. and wheels went into motion very quickly. We were, again, not directly involved, but the PMG was fired up to get microwave links all up and working. The Park CSIRO people, by sheer good luck, there were quite a few people physically at Parks who were capable of reconfiguring. The whole idea of Parks, of course, was the extra gain on the one hand and the narrower beam width of the big dish on the other, because Joe, you probably wouldn't have appreciated it at the time, but we did have the S4B still transmitting at this stage on the same frequency as the lunar module. And that really was a big problem from our point of view. So that's my main recollection of that particular. Oh, and a team was put on an aeroplane led by Bruce Window within, I don't know, a couple of hours of the request, and flown on a private plane to Parks to staff up Parks. So a big effort by many people to get the comms working in the Australian environment.
So I think this is a picture here of Honeysuckle Creek around the time. Is that correct, Mike? John?
Probably. It's all the usual players there, John, I think, aren't they?
Sorry, I'll go back. Sorry.
And the Parks dish had a beam width of about 0.1 of a degree. 0.1 degree, whereas the 85 foot was about 0.3 of a degree. So a hope was that one could separate the S4B signal from the lunar module signal angularly. I don't honestly think we really achieved that, because by the time everything was up and go, I think the S4B was relatively close to the moon. So that's my bit of the background. John, you got anything to add? There we go. There's Bruce Window leaning over. Jack Dickinson, John Bolton, the director of Parks, is up at the left there.
So this is up at Parks, so reconfiguring things up at Parks to bring it online. Is that right?
Yeah,
yes.
Just after Bruce had arrived at Parks and was getting things set up, and just about to receive the first signals.
And of course, Parks is simply that, a receiver. Unlike the movie The Dish, you can't transmit from Parks, if I'm not mistaken, gentlemen.
That's right.
Anyway,
that's right.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Does John have anything to add?
I was just going to say that we haven't mentioned so far that because we had to acquire one or the other of the spacecraft first, like either the S4B or the CSM, the LEM, and it was a real problem tuning the uplink transmitter to pull the downlink signal away from the other vehicle, and it was so bad that at one point we had to ask Houston to get the astronauts to switch off the lunar module, and this was so we could acquire the S4B, pull it off to one side, and then acquire the LEM when they switched it back on again. And I don't think Houston were terribly impressed when we suggested that at this time we were somewhat in extremis, or the mission was.
That was
I understand, John,
that was a particularly dramatic decision from my point of view, that we got the signals separated, and then Houston comes up and says, "Oh, we want to tune one or the other, can't remember which." And we all knew instantly that was going to screw things up again. And I had anybody and all the USB people and everybody shouting in my ear saying, "No, don't." So I went back to Mrs. Hughes and says, "Well, don't do that. It's going to mess things up." And I got it on the line, and they backed me up. In the end, Mr. Houston said, "Do it." So we did it. And everything we forecast occurred, screwed up the uplink, and therefore the only way out of that mess was, as John said, to ask the command module to turn itself off, which was rather a catastrophic request at that stage. And I only found out about 2 years ago why that was requested. It turned out that Houston could only process our tracking data if the transmitter was on its nominal frequency. We can't go into the technicalities of that, but so they could not process the tracking data unless the transmitter was on the center frequency, which is where we did not want to be from a comms point of view. Anyway, another time and place and go into that detail.
So for people watching this, my understanding is, and forgive me because I really don't know much about this, but the S4B stage was planned to crash into the moon. It had a transmitter on it, which was in fact on the same frequency as the lunar module. Is that correct, Mike?
Well,
so
yeah,
they were
but it
both
was more
transmitting.
that's correct. But it was more than that. They added extra batteries on that particular mission to be able to track the S4B to lunar impact, to get accurate tracking data. So the S4B and its transponder were normal fit. It's just that on Apollo 13, they added extra batteries. That's my understanding.
And can I just add there, Mike, the reason you could pull the two apart was that the transponder on the spacecraft, whichever one it was, would follow the uplink frequency as you changed it. So you could move one away from the other. That is it
correct? Correct. It was a phase lock system. And just by the by, I happen to have had a little bit of sort of a mini experience of this in my Tibimbilla days. It looked at one stage that if we would have had two surveyors on the moon transmitting on the same frequency, surveyors 2 and 4, but in practice it never really happened. But we did run simulations at Tibimbilla to cope with two S-band signals on the same frequency. So I had some confidence that the tuning of the signal one way and the tuning of the signal the other way would work.
So, Joe, this probably would have all been completely invisible to you back in Houston in the Mission Control Center. Is that right?
That is true. I had no idea that was going on.
Right.
And of course, it was always low signal. And as Joe has said, we all had the joy of listening to the lots and lots and lots of hiss and noise. The voice was such a low level. Everybody had to work damned hard just to pick out the audio.
Mm-hmm.
So
you should have tried Apollo 16 where the LAM high gain antenna failed, and it was I think the voice signal was below the noise. You had to sort of make quite a few assumptions about what was being said.
wow.
Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. I was just sharing, I pinched this off Colin's website and I put it to this is the separation of the lunar module from the command module just prior to re-entry, and series of still pictures which Colin's put into a GIF, which is really fantastic, I think. So, I've got this out of order, but it looks like everyone's pretty happy because the boys got home, as we all know. And I'll try to modify this layout here.
There was one little period in between there that I would like to mention.
Oh, please do.
The command module entered blackout, and the blackout was calculated to be a certain number of minutes. I can't remember exactly, 3.5 or 4.5 or so. At the end of that time, I was given the nod to say, Odyssey Houston, standing by. And everybody was happy and relaxed, but nobody answered. And I waited 30 seconds and said it again, and waited 30 seconds and said it a third time. And by this time, the room had gone totally quiet. Everybody was sitting there looking straight ahead, saying, what the hell went wrong? And was it my fault? And now it was maybe 10 more or 20 more seconds after that we heard, okay, Joe. And everybody's smiling.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And there was a reason they determined later on, Joe, that for that delay, Was it something to do with the angle of entry or some
It
other?
must have been, but I never heard the story. I don't know. I know that there was a phenomenon that was happening on the way back where the spacecraft was getting slightly above its planned trajectory and required some small burns to put it back on correction. And I can't remember when they discovered it. Might have been post-flight that it was the water boiler on the LEM that was still functioning to a small extent, and the water vapor had a certain amount of thrust, and it was just pushing the LEM out of place. That might have continued after the last burn had been responsible for it, but I didn't hear that at the time. Just scared us.
But we at Honeysuckle took the last pass, Joe, before re-entry. This is a sort of indicator of the track across Australia. We took on from Carnarvon because by that time it was a west to east track. And so we tracked the command module on one of our antennas and the lunar module on the other, Tippinbilla being the other one. And the pass was fairly uneventful, but people kept, we were having quite an intermittent signal from the lunar module because it wasn't stabilized in any manner, as far as I can recollect. And we kept thinking we'd had the last signal from the lunar module. They were more or less, well, on more or less the same trajectory, but eventually I called the final LOS on the command module as it went over the horizon, and then we never heard another bloody word. Nothing came down any of the nets, and Tom Reed happened to be there, and we both said to each other, "Well, what happened?" And so Tom rang up wife Margaret at home and said, "Well, we don't know what's happened. No one's telling us anything." She said, and she replied on the phone, "I'm watching it splash down on the television." So he knew more about what was happening than we did at that stage.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's fantastic. Well, brilliant work by everybody involved. So that was the splashdown point east of Australia. Actually, not too far from the Cook Islands and the Samoan Islands. So there we go. And John, Mike, you sent me this screenshot here, and I thought you might want to mention what's happening here.
Given that the Space Association of Australia has a lot of nerdy people, this is one of the latest versions of Apollo in Real Time. It's the ultimate nerdy website, but anybody who's keen and interested enough can go to that, go to about this GET, I think it's 142.24, I think it is, and choose to listen to anybody and everybody, Joe in particular. And if you listen to the network channel, you'll hear me and John chatting back and forth. As I say, it's fascinating. And they've just added, bottom right there, this is brand new, the text of the audio on the various comm channels. So you can really relive the whole thing, up to and including what I regard as Joe's big call of the time, which was, "We've got you on the mains."
Yeah,
Beautiful.
that, yeah, that was a
Was one of
call.
the most memorable calls of the lot.
Yes.
Well done. Very well done. All right. So after the mission happened, you had a visitor up at Honeysuckle Creek there, gents.
Jack Swigert.
John can speak. I wasn't there at that time. John?
I guess that's Alan Shepard, is it?
No, that's Jack
I
Swigert.
don't.
So,
Jack Swigert's on the left, and I don't see another astronaut that
No,
I.
I think this is
It's
the
the
US
US
ambassador in
ambassador.
the middle.
That's the US ambassador in the middle there. I don't know who the other fellow is in the glasses.
The other man is the head of the Australian US Association in Canberra.
Oh, there you
And
And
go.
the gentleman on the
Don
right
Gray.
is
Don Gray.
Don
Station
Gray.
director.
When in doubt, ask Colin.
Exactly. Fair. All right, Joe, we'll head back to you and what was happening in your world. And this thing called Skylab was on the horizon, and you were a part of it.
Yeah, I finished off the Capcom duty and went right back now to pretty much full-time work on Skylab. A typical day would be that PJ Whites and I would get a T-38 early in the morning, take off from Ellington Field in Houston, point the nose to 81 degrees, as I recall, and get up to 17,500 feet just under the controlled airspace, and then pour the coal to it and arrive in Huntsville in about 58 minutes.
Wow.
Wow.
We could get on with a day of either meetings, some decision meetings on systems, or some of these fun early times when we'd go over to their working building and they had a big 20-foot diameter circle and chalk on the floor, and the divisions, and they were working on, where the different pieces of hardware were going to be. And we would chime in when we had an idea. The one idea that they didn't want to accommodate was to put a window on it. And we had to work really hard and get some high-level help before they would agree to break into the upper stage and put a great big 1-meter window.
Oh, wow.
I'll tell you, we would have died without it. It was our window on the world.
Indeed.
260 miles up. And we did a lot of work in the WIF, the water immersion facility, which was a lovely big water tank that some engineers made out of some booster parts that they found scattered around, and made into a great big circular tank, got it all outfitted. And then, only then did they invite von Braun to come and have a look, because it's slightly illegal to build a building, if this was a building, without going through all the headquarters muck that takes 3 or 4 years. And he went and he looked it all over, and he looked at the water, and he looked at it, and he says, "I want to get in there." And they knew they had one. And so it was a good water facility. It was big enough to hold a mock-up of the entire Skylab. And we spent many hours in there practicing things like recovering the film from the canisters on the Apollo telescope mount. We had all these wonderful sun telescopes and cameras. That was the big reason for our having spacesuits and a little airlock on Skylab. There was no planned maintenance of Skylab. They didn't do any on Apollo, and it was considered unsafe. Well, it got safer in a hurry. But we got pretty expert in the suit and launched many hours. We often did two or 3 hour sessions in a day, and when we did that, we had to stay overnight to let the nitrogen wash out of our blood so we wouldn't get bends in the T-38 on the way home. But it was good, and we also got involved back in Houston with talking to the experimenters as well as the engineers on the different systems and getting our 2 cents worth in on things like the food system. The principal investigator of the food system was a guy who knew how to do bed rest studies and did them in a very controlled way. And everybody ate the same diet all the way through the test, and before the test and after the test. So he wanted us to do that. And he knew that you burn about 300 calories a day less in weightlessness than you do in 1G, because you're not moving those big muscles as much. Unfortunately, what he knew happened to be wrong. And in addition, he wanted everybody to have the same number of calories per day. Jack Lausma, 230 pounds, athlete, 3,300, 3,400 calories a day. And Alan Bean, a very smart guy, but kind of scrawny. He was like a 1,900 calorie guy. So we complained to Deke and said, they can't do that. Deke wrote a lovely memo saying, we were raising astronauts, not stuffed geese. You've got to fix this and let them eat what they need. Finally, they let us sit down at a table and eat Skylab food for a week till everybody had an accurate calories per day mark, and then they built that much food into our systems. They were very strict. Any food you did not eat or only partially ate, you had to weigh the can to make sure that they knew how much of the food wasn't eaten. So we got together and said, we know we've got a little weight thing here, but the heck with it. Let's make a resolution that if we open a can, we eat it all. And we all said, yes, we'll do that. And it was easy because the diets that we were given still had this 300 calories subtracted from them for this supposed lack of need on space. So to get to the results, the first crew, us, lost an average of about 8 pounds. The second crew, who exercised more and got to eat more of the so-called empty calories, candy and cookies. The cookies were good. They lost a little less than that. And then the third crew finally made the breakthrough where they they added back the 300 calories. And one of them, it wasn't Bill Pogue, it was Jerry Carr, the Marine, actually gained a pound in 84 days on Skylab. So over the 3 missions, we finally got that taken care of. Let's see, we had the vestibular experiment, the motion sickness experiment, which was one of the least popular experiments you can imagine. You got into a rotating chair and you rotated up to whatever your RPM had been defined to be on these on 1G tests, which were particularly unpleasant. What you did was you got in, let's say 7 RPM or 10 RPM, and then you did head motions in all 3 axes like that for as long as you could until you got nauseated.
Yeah.
And then you got to stop. But there were some occasions when the nausea was followed by the vomiting.
Oh, good.
And so we traveled to Pensacola, where the PI was, and he was a wonderful guy, and just told him what the problem was and asked for 2 things. Let's back off from nausea to just awareness that things aren't going right, and until we stopped, and then exempt the commander on the first mission, just in case we need to fly back in a hurry. We want Pete Conrad to not be thrown up. And he said, absolutely, and you can borrow my car. He's a really good guy.
So,
that was
sorry, Joe. So this is the selected. What stage were you selected to the Skylab 2 mission, Joe?
All this stuff went on before anybody was selected to.
Oh, right.
But after Apollo 12, it was in 1971. Pete Conrad and Alan Bean volunteered to be commanders on 2 of the 3 Skylab missions. That was another big help to the program because we had their experience, and they were guys who actually wanted to do this long duration flight, having just both landed on the moon. Everybody else who landed on the moon disappeared into the world of better jobs and stuff like that. But these guys stuck around and started running the program, and we had pretty much the same group of guys, but we didn't have flight assignments yet. And Pete just did a Skylab sort of operational diagram and gave everybody their jobs for the next year and a half. And then it was about early 1972. We'd already run the Skylab medical experiments altitude test, where we got 3 poor astronauts to get in the chamber and building 7, was it, for 56 days and eat the food and do the exercise and do it all in this little place. Bill Thornton was one of the crew, and he's the guy who destroyed the exercise ergometer by running it at 300 watts when it was supposed to be topped at 250, and the wiring just burned out. So we said, well, what are you going to do to fix it? And the engineer said, we think we'll just cap it at 250 and not let you go any higher. And that was okay with us because we didn't normally go that high anyhow, just Bill. But that test was very important in fixing the food system and the exercise system and some of the other things that were difficult to design and were giving us trouble. And they fixed a lot of those problems. And then it was time for Deke and Al to issue at a Monday meeting a series of 15 names who would be now part of the Skylab astronaut crew, primes and backups. He didn't say who was who. He did not say which was which. He just gave us the numbers and smiled and walked out of the room. But it took a little time for us to figure out, or for Pete to tell us, that the first three names were the Skylab 2 prime, and then the second three were the Skylab 2 backup, and so on. The same backup crew sufficed for the second mission and the third mission. And so we had about a year and a half to exercise as crews, train as crews, do the formal simulations, do the final changes that we required or requested or begged for in the experiment protocols, all designed just to, our changes were all designed just to make us able to be sure we could do it. And about a month before launch, Chris Kraft called us up in his office. He said, are you guys ready to quit complaining and just get on with the program? And Pete assured him that the complaining was all over. We were with the program and we were going to make them proud. So we did. I'm not sure if I got anything else too exciting to say about the Skylab, although we did have a patch and we got a science fiction artist to do the patch for us. And we liked it and made copies and all that stuff.
Now, I understand, Joe, that there's something wrong with the patch.
Yeah, the bottom tips of the those are the solar panels for the ATM. Should be this side of the solar panels for the Skylab, but he made them behind.
Oh no, there's something even more obvious than that. But
okay, well, Skylab 1, are you talking about that?
Yeah.
Well, that was, it was funny. We thought as we went through our training, even as for PJ and me and a couple other guys had been in this program on and off for 6 or 7 years, right from birth, and we didn't know that Huntsville wanted to do its own nomenclature. We figured there were three crews, so we'd name them 1, 2, and 3. And we actually got the patches done. And then Huntsville said, that's not correct. Our nomenclature is that the workshop itself is Skylab 1, and you guys are 2, 3, and 4. We insist on it. So we said, okay, but we're not changing the patch.
Fantastic. All right, I think I've got a couple of training shots here. So here's the prime crew, you and your colleagues, Pete Conrad and
we got along just great. Pete is a very outgoing guy. He's opinionated, but he's also willing to listen. He was very good to PJ and me. You just convinced him you were working hard, and he let you do what you wanted to do pretty much.
That's great.
And so Pete was great to have. But the other thing about Pete was that he would speak up at any level required to try and get something fixed. And in the mission, in the first week of the mission, we had the big solar panel locked down, and we were preparing. The backup crew was preparing a scenario for us to do that. So we were very underpowered. And we had this absolutely mandatory spacewalk coming up on day 10 or 12. And we had difficulties working the ergometer to stay in shape. It was a bicycle ergometer. And one of the backup crews had designed a very elaborate shoulder harness to keep us firmly down on the seat. But that's not how you ride a bike. You don't ride a bike firmly down on the street. You get your behind up there and you push it, you know. And we discovered up there that that is true, and that we could not, wearing that harness, get up to our maximum energy levels, work levels, because the straps cut through the thighs, cut off the circulation to your legs, and they just quit along about 100. So that was no good. And we were working on that. And the boys in mission control, and particularly the surgeons, you know, this was the big medical mission they'd all been waiting for. And they were nervous as heck about something going wrong. And Pete was working so hard trying to get up to speed that he was throwing an occasional premature contraction. No harm. It appeared, you know, infrequently and was not a sign of a heart problem. But they insisted that that nobody was going to ride that bicycle unless it was over a stateside pass where they could look at every heartbeat. And Pete couldn't go on the spacewalk. Well, Pete said, "Meet the director." And Pete and Chris had a nice conversation. I was only asked to break in to assure Dr. Kraft that Pete and the rest of us were in excellent physical condition. And he said, "Call the doctors off." And the doctors agreed to compromise that if Pete was able to do a run on the bicycle without a PVC, he could go on the spacewalk. And at the same time, we found out the solution to the harness. The solution to the harness was to carefully wrap it up and replace it in the locker from whence it came. Ride that bike, but just letting your body go forward till your CG was over the wheels, and you could go as high as you wanted. And so he did one of those, and he didn't have a PVC, and we did the spacewalk, and it worked.
Fantastic. John, could you just mute your mic? I think we're getting a bit of an echo there. Sorry.
Sorry.
It's okay. Just on the screen there, Joe, I think there's a shot there of you, that spinning chair that you were talking about.
Silly rotating chair. Yes, this is a 1G look, obviously. The way I'm bending over, you can just tell. And Pete's got his Minnie Mouse headgear on there to close his eyes. And he's got we all had molds made of our teeth so that you could then attach the mold to that sidebar, and your head would be absolutely still for certain parts of the vestibular experiment. It had about 4 parts, and so we're doing that. But the bad part of the rotating chair was when you took that stuff off and just started nodding your head and rotating at a speed guaranteed for you to not like it. You know, and again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the discovery on orbit was from the very first time, and we delayed doing this testing until about day 7 or day 8, depending on the crew member, to let you get totally over any DSMS that you might have had earlier in the flight. What is DSMS? Well, the doctors called it space adaptation syndrome, because they were too polite to say space motion sickness. But we crew members called it dreaded space motion sickness, or DSMS. I've got a shirt that says "Stamp out DSMS."
Fantastic.
So we didn't want to get close to that, and we found that in weightlessness, once you were adapted, you didn't get space motion sickness from rotating in the chair, and that was a glorious invention or find out. Okay, here we are with the food. The food system it had very strict controls on it, so it was hard to build and all of that. But they got all that done. And we had these nice trays, and you can see the big window that we fought so hard for there in the background. It always faced the Earth side as we went around during the day, with the sun behind us. So we got great views of the Earth.
Wonderful. And this is the 1G trainer in Houston. You're inside there.
This is
Oh, there's a better shot of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it has food that in cans that would fit tightly down into those circuits, and you could heat it right there for a period of time if it was something to be heated. The drink compartments were those squeezy things, and you just press with your teeth to open them and then squeeze gently, and that all worked fine. It really worked pretty well. And the problem was we didn't have enough of the food. The food was really good, by the way. They worked hard to make it palatable for the first time in the history of spaceflight, and did a wonderful job.
So I'm just running through a couple of training shots here, Joe. This is obviously, I think the caption is, "This is Pete Conrad in the 1G trainer." Looks like he's on some sort of device here to orient himself.
Yeah. At a glance, I can't remember what he's doing. It looks like he's standing on or near the chair. I think this is the chair that we used to operate the Apollo telescope mount, which was a big, complicated panel of controls and displays. We carefully designed the chair. We used the chair for about 3 days, maybe 4 days, and then we said, "This is dumb. We don't need a chair. All we need is to put our feet in our triangle shoes into slots." And so we packed the chair off, folded it up, and the subsequent crews didn't use it at all.
It could have saved you 100 pounds of equipment there, couldn't you? Not putting that on board.
Yeah.
So this is the caption on this one is you guys in the command module simulator doing some launch simulations.
I suppose I can't tell you whether that's the flight spacecraft or not. It looks to me as if it.
I got this picture from a NASA site. I believe it says it's in the simulator. So it looks like that's you in the center there, Joe. Is that correct?
That's me in the center. The command module pilot, or the science pilot, as we call them on Skylab, gets the center couch. The commander is on the left side, and the systems guy, which was Paul Weitz on our crew, is over on the right.
Right.
Yeah. It was tight, but once you're in weightless, it gets bigger.
Sure.
First thing you do when you're weightless is you unfasten that center couch. There's some pull pins, and then you slide it under the left-hand couch, and then you've got an open space there where you go to the lower equipment bay. You can operate the telescope, and second, you can go to the bathroom and use some of the other equipment. And when we slept, you could either sleep on your couch or just sleep on the ground, on the floor. And we only slept in the command module for the first couple of days.
Right.
The water tank in Huntsville with the mock-up. The big white thing on the left is the Apollo telescope mount, a wonderful collection of telescopes and cameras. And we accessed it in order to change camera film through an airlock, which is not clear to me where the airlock door is. But here's a ladder going up, I think. Yeah, that's the ladder going up. We would egress the airlock module, go over to the ladder, hand over hand to the sun end of the ATM, and there were foot restraints up there, and you could manipulate the doors, make sure they were open. Our first time we did it, we did that on the EVA after fixing the solar panel cover. We went up there to make sure everything was shipshape, and one of the doors was closed. It wasn't supposed to be closed. So we opened it, and they started getting pictures.
Right. So, of course, this picture is pre-mission. So this is when
Oh, yeah.
everything was supposed to be correct and none of that other stuff that you eventually had to do was envisaged. So this is standard
Right.
operational EVA stuff, films, etc. What other EVAs were like standard EVAs were scheduled for your mission?
Only one a month. So we had one scheduled EVA before the the problem required us to do a couple more.
Right.
Yeah.
So
And
you would like on your if your mission had gone as per the plan, you would have done an EVA towards the end of the mission to retrieve the
toward
film
end of
of
the
all the
mission, collect and change the film.
right.
And
Right.
second crew would do two of those, one in the middle of the mission, another at the end, and the third crew at that time for planning purposes would also do two. But we did so well on the first two flights that they extended the third mission to 84 days.
Right.
So we would do three. And
So
say
Joe, this
something.
caption is a pre-mission photograph of a student experiment, I believe it was carried.
Yes, I'm trying to remember the name of that spider. It didn't fly until the second flight. It was
Oh, is that right?
deal.
Is
And,
that
Arabella,
Arabella?
huh?
Arabella?
Arabella was the spider's name. And to hear Owen describe it, as I recall, the first time the Arabella tried to do a web, it was a mess. But the second time was good. And it looks to me as if what they're looking at is a post-flight depiction. Maybe they couldn't have brought it back through re-entry G's and still had such a beautiful result, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I think this is this is basically
Might be a
a
pre-mission.
pre-flight sort of, I
Yeah,
guess they did an
pre-flight.
analog simulation of the experiment on the ground.
That was one of the student experiments. We had a bunch of student experiments, and this is a time, I know you're going to cut this up and make it all fit right, but as it occurs to me, the problem with Skylab 4 was that 2 was successful after a very long, we wasted, from a scientific point of view, quite a few days getting the thing activated in the heat, getting the parasol out, and all of that, and then getting ready for and doing the EVA. And it sort of masked the fact that we were not very efficient in our first several days, and we got more and more efficient. By the time you'd been up there for 8 days, you were popping around and doing your thing and thoroughly acclimatized. But that first week you weren't, and you weren't as productive. And the second flight had the same difficulty. They had 56 days, however, to get over it and get on with it, and they exceeded their experiment hours and in numbers by quite a bit. So everybody thought, well, there's no problem up there doing experiments, and Skylab 3 is going 84 days, and it's going to be the last Skylab mission ever. So come on, boys, pile on. And they added a lot of experiments without adequate crew review and without adequate time thinking. And they started overloading the crew right from day 2. And the crew fell farther behind, and they got more and more discouraged and upset, and the mission control was discouraged and upset because why wasn't this crew doing what the other 2 crews were doing? Well, give them a time and they will. But it took about 3 weeks for those people to finally get to the point where they did an offline conference between the ground and the crew, and realized what had happened and started paring back on the daily load. And they ended up in 84 days, again, exceeding their number of experiments and doing a wonderful job. But it was sticky there.
Yeah.
And some jerk from the East Coast wrote a book called The Flight That Failed.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
So, Joe, we're coming close to the end of part 1, and you have been selected. You're training for your mission. Your ride to space is rolling out of the assembly building there. You're Saturn 1B on the milk stool, I think they called it. And were you there for that rollout? Do you recall?
Have I seen this picture before?
Yes, but were you actually there at that rollout?
No,
No, you didn't go there?
We did not see the rollout. We visited down there after the rollout, and there's a picture of the three of us standing in front of that spacecraft in the background, the booster.
Right.
I can't say anything interesting about the launch because it was perfectly nominal. Even for a rookie, you've listened to enough debriefings that you're pretty well set on what it's going to feel like. We were, of course, in a state of some anxiety about the job we had to do and about pulling that solar panel up. But we were ready. We had a bunch of equipment there, some of which we had never seen before, some of which we had. I forgot to say when we were looking at the water tank that shortly after the failure in the launch, we, the crew, went down to Huntsville and we did a couple of days worth of practice EVAs in the tank, trying to erect the different proposed heat shields over the orbiter. We'd done that a couple days, and it was evening, and the word came over the loop that we've been asked to return to Houston, so we're going to backup crew is going to take our place, and we're going to go back to Houston. So we said, okay, and we got down, took our suits off, and went back over to the motel. And there was Deke Slayton with 2 big pizzas and a bunch of beer. And he got us in there, and we had our beer and our pizza, and violated our scientific pre-flight menu just at one time. And we never told anybody about it, and they never asked us anything about it. So I guess the measurements went okay, were undisturbed.
So the picture on the screen, Joe, is actually not a real picture. It's 2 pictures merged together. Both vehicles are not that close together. So that's the Saturn V rocket on the left with the Skylab vehicle with it, all of its insulation on, I know. And there's your ride on the right, the Saturn 1B, and of course the Skylab 1 with the actual orbital laboratory launched first, right. and then you were scheduled. I think how close after that launch were you scheduled originally to go into space?
We were scheduled to go up the next day.
Oh, right.
4 hours after the launch of the workshop. We had our families and our friends and all those people down to watch the launch. And we had scheduled for them, not us, a big party down at the Air Force Base the night before. Then, of course, this happened, and it very quickly became clear that there was not going to be a launch the next day. But we anxiously called our wives and people and said, go ahead and have the party and then go home. And we'll see you after the flight, which was being optimistic at that time.
Fantastic.
And we actually launched 10 days later. The orbit was such that it passed over the Cape accurately enough to launch every 5 days. So our launch opportunities were 5 days, 10 days, 15 days. And they were really going for 10 days because they were using attitude control fuel to maintain the workshop in some kind of attitude to keep it from getting too hot, and also keeping some sunlight on the solar panels for the ATM, which they did have and use. Right. So it was quite a dance for 10 days for mission control to keep that thing in an attitude and circumstances that made it okay for us to launch.
Fantastic. So, Joe, that other picture before, as I say, was a kind of a merging of 2 pictures. This is a picture of your vehicle in the foreground with the Saturn V with Skylab laboratory in the background there. So I think you were on 39B and the lab was on 39A. Is that correct?
I think that's right. I've lost my picture now, and I don't know why, and I'm kind of afraid to to push anything lest I lose you guys
Well,
too.
we've actually almost come to the very end of this segment, so it's probably not too
worried
too
about it.
critical at this point.
Yeah.
So yeah, Joe. So thank you so much. Yeah, we'll pick up on the rest of the fascinating story of your
Okay.
mission and your post mission career.
Yeah.